Our first reading today is from Hebrew Scriptures. We will be following the life of, we have been following the lives of the patriarchs, and now we are moving into the fourth generation. We don't call Joseph, the son of Jacob, a patriarch, but this is certainly within the salvation history that we will finally reach at the time of the Exodus. What we have now is Jacob, who was the third patriarch, who labored for his father-in-law so that he could marry his beloved Rachel. And his father-in-law tricked him and put Leah in the tent that night and said, you can work another 7 years and then you can have Rachel. So he did. So Jacob not only had 2 wives, he also had access to his wife's handmaids, concubines basically. So he had 4 wives. This is family values. Had a lot of kids. As you may know, he eventually had 12. But we're going to hear about how these brothers got along. He didn't just have boys, but that's whom we're dealing with today. So from the 37th chapter of Genesis, we're going to start hearing the story of Joseph, who at that point apparently is the youngest, I'm not sure, but maybe the youngest son, and he is one of 2 sons eventually that were born to Jacob through Rachel, his beloved. So Joseph is kind of special. Jacob settled in the land where his father had lived as an alien, the land of Canaan. This is the story of the family of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's servants' wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now, Israel, which you may remember, God gave Jacob the name Israel, the one who strives with God after he wrestled with the angel. So Israel. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any other of his children because he was the son of his old age. And he had made him a long robe with sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream that I dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. He had another dream and told it to his brothers, saying, "Look, I've had another dream. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What kind of dream is this that you've had? Shall we indeed come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow down to the ground before you?" So his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I'll send you to them." He answered, "Here I am." So Jacob said to him, "Go now and see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring word back to me." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron. He came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields. And the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I'm seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." The man said, "Oh, they've gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Just throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, so that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit, a dry cistern. The pit was empty, there's no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels, carrying gum and balm and resin, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. Here ends the first reading. The second reading is the familiar story of Jesus walking on water. But of course, the foil to all this is Peter. So listen for God's word to the church. Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain to pray by himself. When evening came, he was there alone. But by this time the boat, battered by waves, was far from land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning, Jesus came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." Jesus said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me!" Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. The Christian liturgical year is one with which we are fairly familiar. We change the duds on the pulpit and the paraments on the pulpit and the communion table. I'm not always very formal about that. So that it reflects the colors of the season. And so in August, we are always in the green season. It's ordinary time. Some people say that green is because, it's the color of life and the ordinary days of life. And others say, look, when the monks used to wear black robes, by this time of year, they were so faded, they looked green, and that's why we use green. I don't know. But right now we are in a long stretch of ordinary time in between the seasons, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, and over to Advent, Christmas, Epiphany. And we'll have maybe 3 white Sundays in there where we had Trinity Sunday, and we'll have All Saints around Halloween, and then we'll have Christ the King right before Advent. But for the most part, we're in a long stretch of ordinary time, which is kind of like our life is most days. The Jewish liturgical calendar is very different. Where our long holiday is in the spring, theirs has almost begun with a preparation time for the high holidays, which are in the fall. Tisha B'Av, or the 9th of the month of Av, was observed this last week, Monday night. It's a commemoration of the fall of the temples, when the Jews were either exiled or scattered throughout the world, and Jerusalem was no longer a Jewish worship center. At that service, the book of Lamentations is chanted in its entirety. If you want to read a sad book in the Bible, it says it's Jeremiah's Lamentations. No one really knows, but it's very, very sad about the city being ransacked. The bottom has fallen out of life as they know it. Everyone has descended into the rubble that's left. In the coming days, the people who are observant of this liturgical calendar, they will return to God. They will climb up. They will ascend into the time of the high holidays that are marked by Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the new year. One of my favorite writers, Rachel Barenblatt, a rabbi, writes each year about the struggle to descend into the rubble in order to ascend into this new experience of a new life. She wrote, "This drama plays itself out on the stage of every human life. We fall down, we get up again. And while our modern sensibilities may be offended by the notion that tragedy or trauma is necessary in order for growth or forward motion to appear, I believe that there are gifts to be found when circumstances have laid us low. As the 17th century Japanese poet wrote, 'My barn having burned down, I found I could see the moon.'" Now, except for Good Friday, I'm not sure that Christians have a way to recognize communally the experience of having lost everything, even ourselves. But we sing about it. And we know there are lots of songs written, the blues, for times when we're discouraged. But we have some familiar hymns that describe us being in a very deep and dark place, so deep that only God can save us. And although we might not sing them a lot because they seem to say that we're in that dark place because we have sinned individually, if you look at sin as much bigger than individual experience, but the brokenness of the world, of the race, it would make a lot of sense even today to sing these. There was that Appalachian tune, "Wondrous Love." We sing sometimes during Lent. And one of the verses is, "When I was sinking down, I won't repeat it on and on. When I was sinking down beneath God's righteous frown, Christ laid aside his crown for my soul." Or the familiar, "I was sinking deep in sin, sinking to rise no more." The chorus says, "Love lifted me when nothing else could help. Love lifted me." And then, "Lord, lift me up and let me stand by faith on heaven's tableland, a higher plane than I have found. Lord, set my feet on higher ground." The psalmists, who echo just about every human experience in those songs, captured the experience of defeat and descent. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord, from Psalm 130. Or, I am like one who goes down to the pit, from Psalm 88. Or a thanksgiving psalm in Psalm 30. O Lord, you have lifted me up. O Lord my God, I cried to you for help, and you have healed me. O Lord, you brought up my soul from Sheol, restored me to a life from among those gone down to the pit. The pit was used to mean the shadowy place of the dead, or Sheol. So in today's readings, there are two lessons where people were thrown or sank into the depths, and their lives, their very lives, were threatened. Joseph would have died that day when his brothers threw him into a dry pit in the wilderness. Even if they hadn't killed him themselves, he wouldn't have lived very long. Only through the machinations of his half-brother Reuben was his life saved, and only through the greed of his half-brother Judah was Joseph pulled out of that pit and sold into slavery. Now, Joseph may have brought the hatred of his brothers on himself with a little help from his dad. He was obviously a tattletale. He enjoyed being their father's favorite, and he had absolutely no sense about keeping his mouth shut about his dreams. But he grew up pretty fast, I imagine, when he got to Egypt. And first he was a slave, and then a prisoner, and later a confidant to Pharaoh, and eventually the treasurer of the nation. Years after the day of being cast into the pit, Joseph the dreamer was able to say to his brothers, not, "See, I told you so," but, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Joseph had to descend before he could ascend, and before God's plan could be brought to fruition. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that as the days go along. I'm sure that's part of the lectionary passage during ordinary time. Then we heard about Peter sinking as he tried to walk on water as Jesus did. What was that story all about? We see Jesus as a miracle worker. He could defy gravity, and it's the law. And he could still the storm. And Peter was, once again, the fall guy to Jesus' wisdom. If this doofus, bumbling Peter, could be put in charge of the new movement that has become the church, then maybe any one of us could conceivably be a faithful follower. Peter had to descend repeatedly in order to ascend, to become the person whom Jesus trusted to feed my sheep. So, when have you found yourself in the pit, or thrashing at unrelenting storms of life that threaten to pull you into the deep, overcome who you are? Things do fall apart in just about every life, I'd venture to say, sometime. Sometimes it's through our own behavior and missteps. We become disappointed in ourselves, maybe even disgusted. We recognize this as sin. And often we aren't even sure if we dare pray to God to get us out of the mess we got ourselves in. But often that's what it's going to take, admitting it and reaching out. Sometimes we crash through no fault of our own. We seem to be at the mercy of some opposing or oppressing or uncaring power. But we can become discouraged and downhearted. We can be angry. Sometimes we can find somebody to blame. Sometimes we can want revenge. That too is brokenness. And that is the power of sin also. Before we can move ahead, we need God's healing so that we don't spend all our time on the negative and on being in the pit. And sometimes we can't even find anyone to blame. Not our boss, not our spouse, not even the system. We sit in the rubble and say, why? Why me? Why my family? And that's when we really are in desperate need of healing, because we have no idea that anything good will ever happen again. We might think that God is frowning on us, somehow punishing us, but we don't know why. And we are alienated from the only one who can lift us up. Some people would say that that's the ultimate power of sin, to cut us off from love, to cut us off from God. In any of those cases of falling down, we grieve what our life was before we fell, before the walls crashed down around us. We grieve who we were, what we had, what we assumed would always be there. Grief is the experience of walking through the valley of the shadow of death. Usually we do come out on the other side, but we come out as changed people. What is also true is that the Good Shepherd has walked with us every inch of the way. Even when the valley was so dark, we couldn't see where we were going. Grief work is work, and no one can hurry it. Now, as this morning when I did a little bit of children's sermon about this, I didn't really talk about grief so much, but I said, what would you feel like if you lost something? And one little boy said, well, someone would cry if you died. I said, yeah, that's one. People would be sad. That's right. We know that grief is a process that we go through when someone dies. It's all the harder if there was unfinished business. It's all the harder if that person died too young. It's much more complicated if there was a violent death. And when there's family quarreling around it, it also makes it very difficult to get started even with the process of grief work. Being a survivor of crime also brings a sense of loss. Trauma can lead to a loss of the sense of safety in the world. And if the crime is at the hands of a family member, it's all the harder to recover. Self-blame, and then the rest of us, though we don't think about it much, we like to blame the victim to try to convince ourselves that, well, it wouldn't happen to me. She must have done something wrong. But all of that blaming adds even more to the pain and the difficulty of healing, so that someone can rise up again, a changed person undoubtedly, but rise up again to life. The loss of a relationship not through death is an all too common descent into the pit these days. It can seem very common until it happens to you, or it happens to me. Some people bounce back very quickly, and others of us take years to come back to the place of defining ourselves as whole people who don't have to refer to ourselves as someone's ex-wife or ex-husband. We know from experience that many life changes cause us to fall and to falter. The loss of a job, chronic pain, illness, moving, empty nest when the last child leaves home, maybe. Might have that several times. Retirement, aging. Most of us in time are able to rise back up, to accept loss, to weave it into our lives, and maybe to even find some high points of living with our losses. Maybe we have learned something. Maybe the ways we have been changed actually are for the good, eventually. But it always takes work and time. And no one should ever say to someone else, well, get over it, or snap out of it. It just makes it worse. Many of us would say that getting over grief takes God's help as well. And often, in the hands and the feet of God's family on earth, of Christ walking around in our bodies. So it's really important for us to know what we can do to help with others' healing. Being there is pretty important. Giving advice, not so much. Sometimes God helps us because we learn yet again how to pray. It might be talking to God while we're driving. I do that a lot. It might be something more intentional and given a special time and perhaps journaling through this process. It might be getting some help from a pastor or a counselor who will let you ask the big questions. But as an aside to this, if you or someone you love has descended into a black hole and is not moving through it at all, they may be suffering from depression, and it means they need help, seriously. That is beyond the normal process of grief work. And too many of us, I'm sure, have known someone who has not emerged from that black hole. So I'm not talking about giving time for grief to happen, but if this is taking way too long, I mean years, or if someone is talking about harming themselves, you need to get them help immediately. For most of us, our grief work will seem interminable at some point. And even if someone else doesn't say, oh, come on, we often will say to ourselves, am I not over this yet? But we will see glimpses of a new life. We'll see some light. We'll find ourselves emerging from the shadowy pit, maybe pulled up by friends, pulled up by God. We'll find ourselves pulled into the boat and the storm losing its fury. Perhaps we will appreciate eventually that God can turn a devastating experience into something else, into a new and changed life, a new way of living where we take nothing for granted, perhaps. There will be the occasional bump in the road where we will stub our toe over that grief, and it will come back with a vengeance. And it'll feel just as bad as it did when it started. But truthfully, it won't last. And you'll look back and say, oh, okay, it was a bump. It wasn't falling into a hole. So if we know that grief that we all experience at some point or another, that it takes work, and to recognize that it takes time, and to know that if we're telling our story over and over again, until maybe it changes a little bit, and if we can accept that there are still more tears to cry, even when we think we've cried every tear we've ever had in our body, if we know this, then maybe we can be gentle with ourselves and gentle with those whom we see grieving, even as we walk through that valley, even as we do the hard grief work. Being gentle is so important, especially with ourselves. So take heart, as Jesus said. Have courage. God does not abandon us at any point in that journey, whether we know it or not. And maybe one day we will be able to say, as Joseph did, looking back on it all, God seems to have had some other plans, and these were not plans for my harm. They were plans for good. May it be so. Amen.